before we get into this interesting realm of the Tuatara, Marc, what exactly does your job involve? Because you work at University College London.
That's correct. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University College London, where I study reptile and amphibian evolution.
Brilliant. And so I guess it's the reptile bit of that work which got you interested in the Tuatara. I mentioned they're from New Zealand. Are they found anywhere else in the world?
Well, the wild animals are found only in New Zealand, but you can actually see them in some zoos around the world. So, but this is an animal in the wild. This is Stevens Island in the Cook Strait between the North and South Island of New Zealand. So on the right there you can see a map of New Zealand, and those black triangles indicate islands or groups of islands where you have natural populations of wild Tuatara. I think most of them are along the north coast, but you do have some within the Cook Strait. And I mentioned that there's also some zoos where you can see them, so that includes Taronga in Sydney, Berlin Zoo. There's 4 zoos in America, which include San Diego, St. Louis, Toledo, and Dallas. And there's also Chester Zoo in north of England, where they have 6 or 7 animals which you can go and see.
So Chester's definitely the place for everyone to go if they want to see one of these animals for themselves. But you mentioned they're only found natively in New Zealand, and it looks like mainly on the islands only, not on sort of the main part.
That's correct. And Stevens Island is an example of one of those. As you can see, there's sheer cliffs all the way around the outside. So it's actually quite difficult to get to them. Often you need a helicopter. And a lot of these islands actually have no real population apart from maybe a lighthouse or a farmstead.
So very, very remote locations. And this is a few more clips, a few more photos of the Tuatara. Tell us a little bit more about them, Marc. Are they fairly friendly animals?
So I wouldn't say they're the most aggressive reptile that we know of. The males can get a bit aggressive in the breeding season, and if you put your hand down one of their burrows, they're likely to bite you. But there are also stories of people who have had them as pets, and people who look after them in zoos say they can actually be quite nice to handle, and you can actually tickle their belly, and they will croak in a way that suggests they might be enjoying themselves.
Brilliant. And you mentioned that they live down burrows. I suppose this is a good time perhaps to talk a little bit more about how they live, and also a very close relationship that they have with some of the other animals in New Zealand.
Yeah, so if we can look at the seabird slide. So many of the natural populations of Tuatara share islands with seabirds, and the seabirds are really important to them from an ecological point of view, because the seabirds provide them with eggs and chicks as a source of food when other types of food like insects might not be quite as available. And also the seabirds make quite a lot of mess. They leave carcasses of fish around and their own carcasses, and this attracts further invertebrates and insects. So a lot of the islands on which the Tuataras live today have got a very rich insect population, partly thanks to the seabirds. And also, although the Tuatara can actually dig its own burrow quite happily, they'll often steal those made by the birds. And the birds seem to get nothing in return in this relationship. So the seabirds are quite important from the Tuatara's point of view.
Very important. So it's just take on the part of the Tuatara.
Yeah.
We do have some film footage of live Tuataras in captivity catching some of their insect prey. So we'll bring that up on the screens just so you can see them in action, because one thing about Tuataras when you do see them in captivity, Marc, is then that they seem quite, they're very still a lot of the time. They don't move much apart from there.
Tuataras do have a reputation of being quite sluggish, slow animals, but this is actually partly because they're cold-adapted reptiles, so they actually live in lower temperatures than we'd normally expect for reptiles, but they can remain active at temperatures as low as 6 degrees, which is quite exceptional for reptiles. And of course, being from New Zealand, this is quite useful at certain times of the year.
So that they'll stay still for most of the time, and then obviously when they see prey or something interesting, they'll put on a bit of a spurt of energy. That was quite quick, that one. I like that.
They can be quick when they want to be.
So they're very reliant on these birds on the islands, but also they're very popular tuataras. Obviously, a few people have heard of them before today, but you, Marc, have brought in all sorts of sort of tuatara books and stories. There's even a little soft toy as well. Are they quite well loved in their native land?
In New Zealand, they have similar status to the kiwi bird. So they appeared on the 5-cent coin for a very long time, and there's lots of books. So there's nursery rhymes and children's stories, and see cuddly toy and other sorts of memorabilia. And the Maori actually includes the tuatara in their art, which is unusual because their art tends to be mainly anthropomorphic, mainly human-based. Otherwise.
So that gives us a bit more of an idea of what tuatara are. But why are they so special? Why are they so different from other animals?
So I guess this is the time to actually talk about what they actually are. So although the tuatara looks very much like a lizard, they actually represent something different. So they're the only living representative of this group called the Rhynchocephalians, which is a separate group to that which all lizards and snakes belong. And the two groups themselves diverged about 250 million years. So everybody in this room are more closely related to a kangaroo than the tuatara is to a lizard.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
Maybe some people more than others.
So that they're very unique, and they're not, tuataras aren't lizards then, they're quite different.
They are different. There are a number of morphological differences, also differences in their DNA and their protein structure. One difference, for example, is the way their skulls are put together. So they have these two bars across the back of their skull, whereas lizards and snakes lack at least one of these bars generally. And there's also differences to do with their genitalia, for example, and other aspects of the soft tissue anatomy.
So quite a unique reptile, and we're going to be having a look at whether that uniqueness has remained over time, or if perhaps there were other tuataras around in the past. But before we go on to that, does anyone have any questions at this point? Anything you'd like to ask Marc about the tuatara? We've got a hand up here. I'll tell you what, I'll come round to you with the microphone. What would you like to ask?
So what does the name come from, tuatara? Is it from New Zealand or?
The tuatara is a Maori name, meaning peaks on back. So in reference to the crest that it has on the top of its head and its neck.
That's quite aptly named. I like that. Yes.
So, I mean, if they're located just in New Zealand, is there just one species of tuatara as distinct from lizards, snakes, or there's a whole bunch of different species?
Yeah.
So in case anyone didn't hear, obviously with snakes and lizards, there are many different types of species. Is there just one species of tuatara?
That's a good question. I think we've got a slide that will help explain that.
Down here.
So essentially there is just one species. A second species was named well over 100 years ago based on some of the external coloration and body proportions, but this wasn't really accepted. And then in the 90s, some protein data suggested maybe there were actually two, which helped conserve this second possible species. But now we've got more genetic data and we've looked at the data more closely. Now we are going back to the idea there is just one species, but that some of the islands contain populations that are different from another. But in terms of whether they're one species or not, we think there's just one, but there are varieties within that one species.
So there's some variation, but not enough to make them distinct species. Good question. Anything else before we move on? Yes.
Are they able to swim? And if so, do they cross between
Okay, are they able to swim, and can they get between those different islands?
That's a good question. There are some anecdotal stories of tuataras being seen swimming in the sea, and sometimes the sea is actually quite calm around New Zealand. But as you can see, some of the islands are quite cliff-bound, so it's possible there's some of the island groups where there's some interchange between animals, like big males, for example. But obviously some of the islands are quite far apart, and it's probably quite a rare event if that does happen.
And, one on the back row. What's the population size?
So there's a lot of surveys measuring the natural population sizes, and I think in total there's about 100,000 wild animals. About 30,000 of those are thought to be present on Stevens Island. This is the island we showed earlier that's in the Cook Strait. But it varies quite a lot, different islands. So some islands only have a few dozen animals on, and there's various breeding programs. And they've also now carried out some reintroductions to islands where they think they went extinct, and there's some mainland reintroductions as well.
And we'll talk a little bit more about conservation efforts later on, but we'll take 2 more questions before we move on. What would you like to ask?
Absolutely. So a big problem in the past has been cats and rats, and it's actually quite hard to know how much of this is to do with them eating the same sorts of foods as the tuatara, and just generally like their smell intimidating the animals, and how much of it's direct predation on the eggs and the juveniles. But once they've removed rats and cats from the islands, the animals have actually started to breed again, and certain populations have recovered. So that's a big concern.
That's a big problem with a lot of native species in New Zealand, isn't it? Is this
Absolutely.
competition with the rats and other animals that have been brought in?
Yeah, so a lot of New Zealand birds have suffered the same problems because of the cats and rats. Yeah.
What was your question? Mm.
Yeah, so there is actually quite a good recent fossil record on the...
Sorry, just a few pictures of tuatara there. Where would you like me to go?
Is it this one? No, it's not that one.
That's the same one.
Yeah. Sorry about this one. That one. Is it there?
Could be. Hang on. Let me see if I can help.
I'll let Charlotte operate it.
This one here?
Okay, so here, all those little green dots, this map needs to be updated, but these are sites where tuatara fossils have been found that are no older than 1 million years. So within the past 1 million years, tuatara were present on the mainland. About 800 years ago, when humans first arrived in New Zealand with the first rats and dogs, they seem to have started to disappear. So only 200 or 300 years ago, there were hardly any mainland populations left. But these fossil sites are important for showing us that the wild populations used to go quite far inland, actually to some quite high altitudes, to areas where there were forests and areas where there weren't. And this has helped justify, from a conservation point of view, introducing them to the mainland and actually increasing the sort of latitudinal envelope that they'll be found in.
Brilliant. Well, that probably brings us quite nicely onto sort of history and tuataras in the past, because that's talking about quite recent fossil finds that have been discovered in New Zealand. But tell us a little bit more about tuataras in the distant past, because was there just one species?
Okay, so let's have a look at this slide. So here you're looking at like an evolutionary tree with Sphenodon, or the tuatara, on one hand, and then you've got lizards and snakes on the other hand, and all this diversity today. And historically, there was this idea that the tuatara is quite an ancient animal and quite primitive and is essentially unchanged, and was almost ancestral to lizards and snakes. But this idea has actually become out of date as we've got to know more about the fossil record, and we now know that the Tuatara is just one example of these animals, the rhynchocephalians, that were actually quite diverse during the Triassic and the Jurassic when the dinosaurs were around. And their fossil relatives are all doing all kinds of different things. Some of them were aquatic and lived in shallow seas, and some of them were herbivorous, and some of them were specialist carnivores. So doing the sorts of kinds of different things that we see lizards doing today. So today is an exception from that point of view.
So there were many other different
Yeah.
species, very diverse, as you said, but it's only the Tuatara that's managed to survive to the present day. And how do we know about all these other species? Have we managed to find sort of complete fossils of them?
So we know about this data from of these animals from a mixture of data. So this is a block from South Wales, from a cave deposit that we treat with acid, and we get out lots of these little tiny bones. And if we use a microscope, we can actually work out the anatomy of these individual bones, and some of them are very nicely preserved. This is a small jawbone of an animal that's related to Tuatara, about 200 million years old. Then we also have fossils such as this from places in Germany. So this is from a shallow sea with very fine limestone deposits. And you can see this looks almost like a modern skeleton. This tells us quite a lot about the anatomy of the animal and how the fossil Tuatara relatives are different from the modern Tuatara.
Brilliant. And you mentioned that some of those fossil finds were in Wales. So does that mean that these species of Tuatara, they weren't just in New Zealand?
No, that's what this is, another animal from Europe. And this is a South American form. No,
Do you want me to get you that?
Yeah, I was going to show you the map. So we do have a
Here we
map
go.
showing all the different...
Now, which one was it? It's the question. This one, do you think?
Could be.
You're going to have to bear with us on this bit, I think. Oh, no.
Here we go.
There we go.
So this is a map showing all the locations where we have fossil Tuatara from. And as you can see, there's a big concentration around Europe and North America, and that partly reflects that those are the places we've been looking the longest. We do have some fossils from China and also South America. So this gives us a good indication this group was once globally widespread, and of course that's partly because the continents in the past were all joined together, so these animals could move between all these different land masses.
Brilliant. So they were all over the place, and as you mentioned, some of them got pretty huge. This was the biggest species that we know of?
Yeah, so this is a big, robust form from South America. This is probably the size of a large badger. So its head is over 10 centimeters long, and these probably ate plants and lived a bit like a reptilian ground squirrel.
Brilliant. Well, at this point, we might just show you a bit more of film footage, because we've got a Tuatara fight. It's not really a fight; it's a bit of a squabble. But I think it's quite nice to play with respect to this giant Tuatara, because obviously you can only imagine what they would have been like if they'd got in a bit of a mood. I think is that about it? Is that as far as it goes, Mark? That wasn't too bad, was it? Which is the female? No, is it easy to tell which is male and female, Mark?
I would guess they're both females.
Right.
The males tend to have much larger crests and much larger heads, and have a slightly less rounded body shape, but it can be difficult to tell because they don't reach sexual maturity until about 13 years of age, and at that point the males still look a bit like females as well. So, but they can live to quite
at quite a ripe old age. We're going to finish off with a nice little news piece about a very old Tuatara who's still going strong. So we'll show you that at the end. But any other questions before we continue? Yes.
What is their predator?
Oh, what is their predator? So we've seen what they eat, but what tends to eat the Tuatara?
Well, if you're a baby Tuatara, it's probably a good idea to keep out the way of adult Tuatara, because they are known to be cannibalistic occasionally. They don't seem to get on very well with cats, feral cats, but a lot of their natural predators are actually extinct now. There are some birds of prey that occasionally feed on them, but essentially on most of the islands they are the apex predator.
So they're at the top of the food chain, and
Yeah.
as long as they survive not getting eaten while they're younger, then they've got a good chance of
Yeah.
surviving for some time. Anything else? Yes. So, right. Are there other lizards in
Yeah.
New Zealand?
There are some geckos and skinks also found in New Zealand, which are interesting because they also breed quite slowly and are somewhat cold adapted, a bit like the Tuatara, but they're much smaller than the Tuatara. So in terms of their ecological role, there's probably very little overlap, and the Tuatara do actually eat them if they can catch them.
And was there another question around the back? Yes. Oh, I can't quite catch that one. Sorry.
Yeah.
So obviously we had Tuatara all over the world before, Mark. Why have they only managed to survive in New Zealand?
It's a very good question. It's quite hard to know because the fossil record of New Zealand, apart from the last 2 million years, is very poorly known. And the Tuatara probably have been there since about 80 million years ago, when New Zealand broke away from the rest of Gondwana. And people have speculated it's because specialised lizards and more modern mammals never got to New Zealand, and they didn't have to adapt to that type of competition, and also that the environments have stayed the same in New Zealand, or changed a bit more slowly compared to the rest of the world. But it's hard to know. Okay.
So could there be anything similar existing elsewhere, do you think, Mark?
I suspect it's unlikely, although I'd like it not to be the case, and it'd be great if there was a population in the Andes somewhere as well. But it's also hard to know about how old this cold adapted physiology is. It might be quite a recent adaptation relating to recent ice ages. It might only be 2 or 3 million years old, and their relatives 80 million years ago were actually more like lizards and could happily live in warm climates. It's very hard to know. We don't know. But whether there's another population, we don't know. There is actually an urban legend that there is an escaped population living in Wales somewhere. But again, I haven't seen any evidence for that.
Just a bit of a legend there. Well, if there are any more questions you'd like to ask Mark, he will be hanging around for a few more minutes at the end of the event. But we have got just a little bit of time left, Mark, because we've been talking all about the Tuatara, and it's fantastic to discover this very unique animal. But obviously, your work is looking at a particular aspect of this species. So briefly, just tell us a bit more about that.
So I'm interested in feeding and the teeth. And as part of my PhD, I was looking at the variation you have in the fossil animals of their teeth. So if we can just look at
Which one would you?
the one on the right, I think.
This one here.
Yeah, this one.
There we go.
So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the Tuatara, and you can see its teeth are quite conical, and they're fused to the jawbones. There's no obvious boundary between the tooth and the bone. And the other 3 examples are other fossil animals. And the top left-hand corner, these are very, very ancient Tuatara relatives. And see, these have rather simple teeth, a bit like what you might expect in a lizard. Whereas in the Clevosaurus and the Elenodontides, these have more specialized teeth with obvious wear facets and blades. So this suggests that in the past, this group were dealing with lots of different types of foods and helped support this idea that they were once a lot more ecologically diverse and important.
And we've got a piece of film footage of a tuatara biting down on some type of equipment. So we'll bring that up on the screens. What are you making this tuatara do, Mark?
So this is a tuatara in Dallas Zoo, and we're getting it to bite on a force transducer to measure how hard it can bite. The transducer's covered in leather pads, so its teeth don't get damaged and it can grip. And you can see it doesn't want to let go once it's got hold of it. And how hard the animal bites can tell us what food it could deal with if it wanted to. But also it's important from a reproduction point of view. So similar to lizards, if you know how hard a tuatara can bite, it can actually tell you how successful it is at reproducing. How hard it can bite gives you a better indicator of how many females it mates with, how large its territory is compared to other males. And in lizards, at least, it's a better indicator than how large the animal is. You can have a small lizard that can bite really hard, will have a lot of females in its territory compared to a large male with a fairly weak bite.
So it's not always about size, it's all to do with sort of how strong your bite is instead. Well, I guess reproduction brings us nicely round to our final film clip, which is a little news story. We mentioned before, obviously, that tuatara, like many native animals in New Zealand, is at risk, and there are lots of conservation efforts to try and help breed this animal, and so consequently it's in quite a few zoos and kind of reserves in New Zealand. But there's a very famous individual called Henry, and he made the news a little while ago, so we'll show you that clip to finish off.
He survived cancer, outlived most of his species, and now he's a father at age 111. Henry the Tuatara is a rare native reptile, a species that resemble lizards and lives in New Zealand. With his girlfriend, 80-year-old Mildred, they are the proud parents of 11 babies, and his keepers are amazed. In March last year, a painful tumour was removed from the reptile's bottom. Henry's aggression disappeared, allowing him some time with the females. But Henry and Mildred won't be spending any time with their kids. This species typically sees them as a tasty meal.
So over 100 years old and a dad for the first time. Very proud moment for Henry there. Any further questions you have, do come and ask Mark. If you'd like to come and have a closer look at some of his tuatara paraphernalia, you're very welcome. Thank you for all of your questions today. I hope you've enjoyed the event. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are here every day at 2:30 with a different scientist, different topic. So do try and join us in the future. But for now, if you'd like to join me in giving Mark a big round of applause. Thank you ever so much for coming, Mark.
Thank you.